The others, yeah.
It was interesting, like the main character when Smithy was, like when Tash was cutting her hair, she was like, I really want to do this. My mom would be mad, and her mom's not there. She's like, yeah, my mom will be mad.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes out of this strongly is just how much mothers were enforcers of feminine gender roles, right? They were the ones that you worried about, disapproving. So, yeah. Any other thoughts on the movie or on the? All right, so we'll watch for the coming of age story in Gallipoli, see if that materializes or not. We will watch for the class disparity and the Irish-English or Irish-Australian class disparity in Gallipoli. And yeah, so let me talk a little bit about the war, and in particular why the war was such a shock. Incidentally, the Smith does not get injured in Not So Quiet. She gets pregnant. And so the whole scene where Paul goes and they're going to send him to the dying room and he comes back triumphant and he thinks he's going to die, and it actually it's about her going back to England to get an abortion, and which I thought was an interesting parallel. Yeah.
Is the end similar or different than?
You read the end of Not So Quiet. That was the end of the book where Tosh dies. That was the end of it. And so just as Kat dies from a single airplane going over, Tosh dies from a single airplane, and it's just as a splinter hit Kat in the back of the neck and it wasn't noticed, Tosh gets hit with a splinter and dies from it. But yeah, that's the end of it. Any other questions, comments, observations, insinuations? I talked last time about how at the beginning of the war, everybody expected a short war, 6 weeks, armies marching around, getting in position, and they fight one battle and it's all over. And that's how it started. You had this massive movements of German troops into Belgium and then into France. You had armies marching all over the place. The French had lined up on the German border and realized the Germans were coming through Belgium and had rushed north to stop them, and so armies were marching all over the place. And then they had some battles, and they were pretty standard set piece battles, but they were horrifically deadly. I talked about the way the British Expeditionary Force was almost wiped out in the first 5 months, and the extreme casualties the Germans and the French had in the first 5 months. And the reason for that was that they were trying to do 19th century tactics with 20th century weapons. And in particular, they were discovering that in the 19th century, they were fighting with basically two types of weapons. And you think of the American Civil War and you've got the idea here. You've got rifles that are, by World War I, they had rifles that could shoot about 5 shots before you had to reload them. But they're single shot rifles. You pull the trigger once, you have to eject the shell and pull the trigger again. So they don't fire very fast. And then you have, in 19th century, you had cannons. But the cannons fired cannonballs or grape shot or canister. And basically that just means they're throwing metal. And if the metal hits you, it's like being hit by a bullet, right? But in World War I, they had 2 new weapons and then later 3 or 4 or 5 that totally changed warfare. And in that first 5 months of the war, they were realizing just how much this had changed. And I mentioned I mentioned this a little bit already, but the first big weapon is a machine gun. A machine gun is about 90 pounds. It sits on a tripod, It gets super hot when you fire it. In fact, by the middle of the war, they have machine guns that are actually water cooled. They have a bag of water that runs over the barrel to cool it off, and so basically it's very difficult to pick up a machine gun and move it because it's 90 pounds, it's on a tripod, and it takes basically 3 guys to run a machine gun. There's one guy who's firing the machine gun, and you saw this in the movie, and then there's one guy who's just feeding ammunition into the machine gun. And then there's a third guy who is just running back and forth to get more ammunition because the gun goes through it so fast that it's a full-time job for one guy just running back 2 miles to the depot and coming back with all the ammunition he can carry and then dumping it and turning around and going back to get more. Machine guns fire about 9 to 12 bullets a second. And it varied a little bit by the gun makers. And World War I veterans could tell you by the sound of the gun whether it was a German machine gun or a French machine gun or an English machine gun or later an American machine gun because they had slightly different cadences, right? Different rhythm. And actually the movie did a pretty good job because the French machine guns did sound different than the German machine guns. But 9 to 12 bullets a second means that you can spray a field of fire and pretty much, you saw people getting mowed down. That was realistic. When troops would charge machine guns, they would just get mowed down 20, 40, 50 guys at a time because machine guns just sweep across and spew so much metal that you can't escape it. And a machine gun, because it's hard to move and because it's so good at mowing down attacking soldiers, is essentially a defensive weapon in World War I. You can't pick it up and go attack somebody. It's good for sitting there. If they attack you, you can stop their attack, but you can't pick it up and go attack with it. And they did try experimenting with sort of putting a machine gun on a carriage like a cannon so you could push it on wheels, and it didn't work very well. And they eventually invented the tank. And the tanks originally, I don't know if you've seen World War I tanks, but they were these enormous things that were about 20 feet long, super long, and they had treads that went over the whole side of the machine, and they did not have turrets or anything. They just had 2 little windows on each side that you could stick a machine gun out of. So they were basically an enormous bulletproof box with a machine gun, and the whole purpose at first was just, we're going to have a bulletproof box we can drive up to an enemy machine gun and blow it up, or shoot it, and then we can bring in the troops. And so they really didn't think of tanks as anything more than a support for infantry troops, right? Infantry troops can't charge machine guns, they get mowed down, so we'll get a bulletproof box, they can drive up to it, take out the machine gun, and then the troops can go in, because that's what is really working. Tanks were invented about 1915. There were a couple of big tank battles. It turns out tanks were, not very well equipped. They were super slow, not very well equipped to handle those battlefields like I talked about, like you saw with all the craters and all the, they just simply, it was too hard to do it. And they didn't have any real weapons. They didn't have cannons on them, they didn't have turrets. They just had a couple machine guns with a very limited field of fire, and so they really tanks couldn't do damage to each other other than ramming each other. And they, so they were pretty limited as weapons.
So, how did tanks hold up against shells?
Those tanks, I don't think they would have done very well. They really did have a window on the side, which means shrapnel could come in. And I don't know what kind of armaments they had, but I'm guessing, given the internal combustion engine technologies they had and how slow things were, they're probably underpowered, which means they were cutting back on the armor. And they basically, I don't think, thought of it as a cannon or artillery-proof box. It was a machine gun-proof box. So I'm guessing they had pretty light armor, but I'll have to check on that. I don't know how it compared to World War II tanks in terms of armor. So machine guns are essentially a defensive weapon. And in World War I, they never came up with an offensive weapon that could counter a machine gun, which was the central problem of World War I. But what that meant was, in those first battles, they're setting up machine guns, and the armies are just on these open fields. And that used to be fine when you're in a Civil War type battle where there's cannonballs coming through and there's bullets coming through, but basically you can just line up your armies and far enough away, but suddenly with machine guns, you can just mow down whole armies in a couple minutes. And that's why they're taking horrific casualties, because they're expecting you can just line up an army like you did in the Civil War and line up and start shooting rifles at each other, and the machine gun is just mowing down whole units, right? And they very quickly realize that you want to get on the ground, so you're less likely to get shot, and then you want to dig a hole in the ground, and then you want to connect your holes with trenches, and then pretty soon they've got the whole trench system. I mean, the trench was essentially a way of getting out of machine guns. The second big weapon that they have is high explosive artillery shells. And I mentioned this previously, but I just want to mention again that in the Civil War, they were shooting cannonballs or canister. Canister is just little tiny pellets. Think of shotgun coming out of a cannon. Shotgun pellets. Only they're like the size of super balls. By World War II, by the 1880s, they had invented ways of putting nitroglycerin in artillery shells so that the cannon would fire a shell, and when it landed, it explodes. And this is a totally different type of weapon because, cannons are just firing through. If they go through an army, they might hit one guy, but an artillery shell can land and take out 20 or 30 guys, right? And artillery shells basically throw out shrapnel, which is small bits of metal. The shell casing itself is blown to pieces. The tiny pieces of metal just spray out in all sorts of different directions fast enough to kill you. And that's essentially why you kept seeing in the movie, the All Quiet on the Western Front, you would see guys, artillery shell go off and guys would fall down 20 feet away. What they were trying, partly it was just, they didn't know how to.
You couldn't blow things up right next to someone at the time.
Yes. But basically, it was not at all uncommon. And it was really kind of bizarre because there were times, World War I soldiers would talk about that, there would be times that an artillery shell would land 30 feet away and somebody would take a piece of shrapnel right in the head and die in a second. But then the guy who was standing right next to where it went off was unhurt because the shrapnel just happened to miss him, or he gets blown backwards by the shock wave, but he doesn't get hit by any shrapnel, and he's basically uninjured. Or there were even cases of guys having their clothing blown off of them, but they're uninjured. And so it's really it's freaky random what happens with this shrapnel. But high explosive artillery shells totally change warfare because cannons now can cause enormous damage, even to soldiers in bunkers, in trenches. High explosive artillery shells are coming in almost vertically. They can go right into trenches and blow them to pieces and send shrapnel down the trenches, and they can collapse bunkers, and they can, this is a horrific weapon. And we saw in, All Quiet on the Western Front just how much damage that can do. And artillery could be an offensive weapon in the sense that the enemy's over there, you can take artillery over here and attack them over there with higher explosive artillery shells, right? You can go, but you're ultimately going to have to send soldiers, right, to take that position. So in theory, the combination of foot soldiers and high explosive artillery shells should allow you to take an enemy trench. The problem turns out to be communication in World War I. They have radios in World War I. The radios have been invented in the 1890s. But radios are fragile. They have glass vacuum tubes. They don't have great power sources. The technology is in its infancy. So radios are basically great if you're sitting on a table somewhere and in an office and you're talking to somebody else in another office on a table, but they don't do well on the battlefield. And so they had a communication problem in World War I, and because the artillery is usually a couple miles behind the lines, and they know where the enemy lines are. They know that if they fire at this angle, it'll land on the enemy trenches. But suppose you want to target a particular spot, you need to know exactly where it is, and they didn't have great ways of knowing what the exact coordinates for that one spot we're attacking are. So what you do is you have sighting, and you'd have somebody go up in the front trenches as close as they could get to whatever you're attacking, and then the artillery would fire, and then that person would tell the artillery, no, you missed a little bit to the left, you got to go to the right 100 yards, and you want to go 50 yards farther out or something like that. And that's great if you have a radio back to the artillery and say, do this. And we'll see that in the World War II movies. We will see people doing exactly that. They're using radios to call in artillery strikes on a spot near where they are because they can see where the artillery would be. And they're helping sight the artillery. But with World War I, they don't have radios that can survive the battlefield very long, so they usually don't have radios. What they try instead is they try running phone lines. They try running wires along the ground, and they'd have phone units that guys could take up into the trenches way up at the front and then call back and say, okay, 50 yards farther out and 10 degrees to the left or whatever. But phone lines can get blown up by artillery shells, and they frequently were. And we will see this in Gallipoli, that this is actually a main plot point, is that phone lines get blown up. And so basically what they relied on was runners. That somebody's job was to go up to the front and say, okay, here's where the artillery shell landed. They need to adjust by this much. And then that person jumps up and runs all the way back to where the artillery set, and they say, okay, you need to go 10 degrees to the left and 50 yards farther out, and then they run back up there, or another guy is up there watching, and they fire another shot, and then that guy comes back and says, oh, you're still too short, go a little farther, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, and this becomes a big thing in Gallipoli also, is the runners. And everybody knows on both sides that if you see a single guy running, he's carrying important information, shoot him. Right, and we'll see that this becomes a plot point in Gallipoli. I will also point out that Adolf Hitler was an artillery runner in World War I, and got the Medal of Honor for it because it's a really dangerous job. Because if you're running alone, they know that you've got orders or you've got information, and you should be shot. But ultimately, that's such an awkward system that they don't really, in World War I, figure out how to use artillery effectively as an offensive weapon. They just simply can't sight it and target it and refine it well enough with the communication systems they have. So they use artillery to do blanket barrages. They know how far away the enemy trenches are, and they just are firing and firing and firing, and they don't care what they're hitting over there. Or they use it. They also have it sighted so that they know where no man's land is between the lines of trenches, and if an enemy is attacking, you start shelling the no man's land. So they can do that, but then it essentially becomes a defensive weapon, right? So artillery has the potential to be a really offensive weapon, but it isn't there in World War I. The other thing that the tanks have a potential to be an offensive weapon because you can go attack something with a tank, but they didn't have the firepower to be good offensive weapons, and they were too slow, too clumsy on the battlefield, so they were not offensive weapons in World War I. In World War II, we will see the tank becomes a superb offensive weapon. It becomes great at attacking things. The third thing that could have been a great offensive weapon is the airplane, right? Airplanes can go attack things, but airplanes in World War I were made out of basically wood and canvas. They were very light, they were very small. They basically could carry one or two people, but not much more than that. And so at most they came up with, airplanes that could carry a single 50-pound bomb along with a pilot or whatever, or maybe two 50-pound bombs. But those bombs are not going to be very effective at destroying bunkers or anything like that. And so airplanes are not nearly as effective as they might have been. You can strafe with an airplane, which is, fire machine guns at the ground on soldiers on the ground. And you can drop hand grenades and small bombs and things out of airplanes. But you've only got one, right? So each airplane flight is not going to be very much firepower. And they never really figure out how to coordinate airplanes with the ground troops, et cetera. The whole radio communication problem comes in again. And so airplanes really, in World War II, they would become a fantastic offensive weapon in two ways, which is high altitude bombers that can just drop massive payloads of thousands of pounds of bombs at a time, or dive bombers, which can pinpoint bombing with fairly large bombs at pinpoint spots on the front. Those become great offensive weapons. You can attack the enemy with that. World War I airplanes are basically useless for that. So mostly what airplanes do in World War I is they strafe the ground and they do reconnaissance. They fly over the enemy lines and look at are they moving troops where and how many troops they have here or there. So airplanes are really not offensive weapons. So in this early part of the war, what they're realizing is that this is the first war with high explosive artillery shells, and this is the first war where Europeans are using machine guns against other people who have machine guns. Both sides have machine guns, and so they suddenly find that this war is an absolute meat grinder, and it's almost impossible to survive above ground. And so by December, from August to December, they have gone from realizing the horrific casualties, trying 19th century charges and things like that, getting cut to pieces, and then they start digging trenches. And they dig and they dig and they dig. So trench warfare was the standard on the Western Front. Now, I should probably mention briefly the different fronts in World War I. World War I really was a world war in some sense. I have a map out. I could try to draw an entire map here.
I believe.
Pardon?
I said, I believe.
There we go. World War I has several fronts in Europe. This here is the Western Front, basically, and this is Germany invading through Belgium into northern France and then getting stopped, and then essentially the front runs from Switzerland all the way up to the English Channel, and I put that map up last time and showed you what that looked like. This is the Western Front. There's also an Eastern Front. Basically, Germany and Austria-Hungary are allies, and they're fighting against Russia. So this is the Eastern Front. It starts here along this border. Russia would initially invade Germany in August of 1914 and would lose badly at Masurian Lakes and then Tannenberg in September and October of 1914. And then Germany would invade Russia. And essentially for the rest of the war, Germany is pushing farther and farther into Russia. And you can see the farthest advance that they would get is here. But this is a war of movement in that Russia launches massive counterattacks and pushes particularly the Austrians back, and then the Austrians and the Germans launch counterattacks and push them back. So there is movement there. And part of that is because there's much more space. The Western Front is really compact. You have a lot of machine guns per square foot. And a lot of artillery per square foot. The Eastern Front is much more wide open, so it's easier to go around armies, flank them, etc. You also have, the Russians in particular don't have as many machine guns, and they generally rely on just sending a whole bunch of peasants at the end of German lines or the Austrian lines. So World War I is closer to what we think of as the Civil War or something. There's also a couple other fronts. Italy would invade Austria-Hungary, basically over the Alps. It doesn't work very well. But there's a front, Austro-Italian front here. There's also Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. That's what started the whole war. Greece would join in and help Serbia. Bulgaria would join in against Greece. And so there's a front down here, basically north of Greece and at the southern portions of Serbia. Any questions about those 4 fronts? Those are 4 distinct different fronts. In addition, the British would send troops from India to land in southern Iraq and invade the Ottoman Empire and push up Mesopotamia. They would actually do it twice. The first time they get utterly destroyed in 1914. The second time they would be basically still succeeding in 1917 and 1918 when the war ends. The British would also, Egypt is a colony of Great Britain's. Sorry, you can see my maps down here. So the British would invade this way up Mesopotamia. They would also, from Egypt, invade Palestine and then Syria, which is part of the Ottoman Empire. And then there's also Gallipoli, which is up here. And of course, that's what the whole movie's about. And then there would be multiple fronts in Africa that basically the British and the Germans would invade each other's colonies in Africa. And they would usually arm Africans to fight other Africans, or Britain send Indian troops to Africa to fight against the Germans. So there were very small scale wars. They were not huge armies. They were 10,000 soldiers here and 10,000 soldiers there, not millions. But there was a lot of fighting all sorts of places across Africa. There's actually a really kind of touching movie called Black and White in Color. But it's about this little, these 2 little colonies, and they hear about the war, and they decide they have to fight. The Europeans decide they'd better fight each other, and so they put together these African armies, and it winds up being horrific suffering for the Africans, but the Europeans think it's all a big game. There's also some fighting in Asia. Germany had a colony in Tsingtao in China. And the Chinese and Japanese would both declare war on Germany to take that, and Japan would wind up grabbing it.
Yeah.
But we're going to focus mostly on the Western Front, partly because the best literature is about the Western Front. There simply isn't any good literature about the Ottoman fighting. There's a little bit on the Italian-Austrian front, but not much. And there's not much on the Russians up here. So you've all heard that dumb joke about the police officer's walking down the street and he sees a drunk guy under a street light. And he's on his hands and knees looking around on the ground. And the guy says, what you looking for? He says, I lost my keys. And he says, and he says, well, let's think back. What were you doing when you dropped them? He says, I was standing in front of that bar over there. He says, why don't you look for your keys over there? He says, well, the light's over here. Historians are kind of like that. It's like, well, why aren't you studying the Russian front? Well, all the written documents are over here on the Western front. So we're going to look at that.